Our next presenter this morning possibly has travelled the longest distance. I think it was 14,158 kilometres from Rotterdam in the Netherlands to Woluwe. So a big trip to be here, and we're thrilled that you've made the journey. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Alonso Ayala, who's going to speak around sustainable urban heritage strategies and adequate housing. Alonso is with the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies in Rotterdam. He's an architect and spatial planner specialising in housing and human settlement planning. He has extensive experience in education and capacity building, advisory and research in housing-related issues at a global level. So we're thrilled to have you here. Please welcome him.
Okay, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Sorry, is this already moving? Yeah. So I would like to thank the elders past, present, and emerging on the land we meet. And with that, I'd like to start my presentation by saying that I'm really very excited to be here, not because of the kilometers I traveled to be here, but because for 3 years I've been talking to Yolanda Kuhl from the Heritage Skill Association to see how can we cooperate and bring together this knowledge of heritage, social housing, and adaptive reuse. So I will try with this presentation to connect these three things and see the relevance of it. But before I start with that, I would like to talk about the challenge that we face, which is a housing affordability crisis. And this touches everyone. But when you see these alarming numbers, then you realize that something needs to change. Right? 1.6 billion people, or over 20% of the global population, live in inadequate, crowded, and unsafe housing. Of this, another 2 billion people are expected to be living in slums in the next 30 years. That reflects the reality mostly of the global south. Still, when you talk about inadequate housing, that touches everyone nowadays globally. Yeah? More than 90% of urban residents living in slums are located in poor countries, as I said, and this accounts to over 1 billion people globally. So that is the scale of the challenge we are talking about. Now, I have to look into the context where I find myself in and look at the Australian context. And I found this in a publications of the UN Habitat from 2022. So I will just read the quotation. In Australia, there is a constant rejection of the view that social housing should be expanded to ensure all households are able to access decent, affordable housing. This view is incompatible with the current global goals of promoting access to decent and affordable housing for all. And when I see that, then I see, okay, what is the connection of this particular saying from the UN Habitat to what is happening globally in terms of the housing crisis? And what you see, that there is this endemic problematic which reflects pretty much the situation of the whole world. And these are, for example, the neoliberal shift towards the market in which there is a declining on the government role in the provision of housing as well as the investment on it. Then the fact that this neoliberal agenda have brought us to a point where housing has become a commodity. So the commodification and financialization of housing is also what have triggered the current housing crisis. Now, if you look at these are all related to Australia, but they reflect also what is happening in most of the world. Then in the case of Australia, tightening social housing allocation, which is also reflects what is happening in the social housing sector in many European countries, is that you convert what used to be a universal allocation of affordable housing or social housing for everyone into a residual model in which you just target it to specific groups. In this case, low-income, physical and mental, and people with physical and mental disability. The ones which are considered in the risk of homelessness and instability to sustain tenancy in the private market, impacting negatively in the financial viability of the sector. So that is what is happening in that is what is happening in the social housing sector of Australia. And that also relates to the fact that the social housing which is provided, or the affordable housing which is provided, is located in places which create social spatial segregation. It concentrates also people of low income, of very, very specific vulnerable conditions. There is also a stigmatization of these projects going on. So having said that, what we try to do at the IHS, where I work, is to look at what is the concept of housing adequacy and how does that relate to housing justice. And as a starting point, we can define housing justice as adequate housing for all. That is housing which is available, accessible, affordable, acceptable, and adaptable to all in an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable way. And with that framework that we call the 5A's framework of adequate housing, the 5A principles of adequate housing, which is a virtuous cycle in which all these aspects should be considered, then we could say that policy making, policy implementation, and the approaches that come from policy implementation should contain all these characteristics. So I will walk you as quick as possible through each one of them to make the connection with what comes next, which are the projects in adaptive reuse of social housing in the Netherlands. So availability is about the housing stock, the number of housing which are available, which are newly built or to be built in projects. And it's also about the supplies of service land and houses in combination with the supply of housing finance. What is important about availability is the locational aspect of the housing that you produce. Where you make this housing available makes a big difference. So that is, in the principle, quite important to consider. As well, the fact that you provide different options that tackles different housing needs. Accessibility refers to that double access that people need to housing, both financially and physically. And when you talk about financial accessibility, you're also talking about affordability, and that is the connection. You need double access to housing, but also to urban infrastructure. Access also relates to the eligibility criteria, which is determined by housing project, who have the access to it. And that is about target groups, etc. And those decisions that are made mostly politically on who should be beneficiary of a particular housing policy. Now, what is important about that is the information as part of that access. Because the fact that you have an existing housing policy that gives priority to certain groups does not mean that they have access to it if they don't know how to do that. So the information is also an important aspect of accessibility. This is just to illustrate what is meant, for example, for availability and accessibility. This is a project in Kosovo for Roma communities, social housing for Roma communities in the periphery, quite far from anything that you could call adequate urban infrastructure, making them isolated in the context and creating new social problems instead of solving them. So this is basically a bad example. So the aspect of location is here highlighted, and the accessibility to urban infrastructure and employment opportunities. Then affordability, which is at the center of the discussion nowadays when you talk about the housing affordability crisis, is, as we all know, the proportion of income spent on housing, which usually is called as the affordability threshold, which should be not more than 30%. That is a rule of thumb. You can define this in many other ways, but that's the easiest way of defining this. This is also about tenure models, because not everyone can be an owner, but therefore, different tenure models also determine different levels of affordability, whether you are in rental accommodation or on your own property. And one thing which is debatable, I will not discuss this here, which is the quality of the affordable unit, which talks about standards, because what we see is that quality is expensive, or what we tend to believe is that quality is expensive, and that maybe needs to be changed. I mean, and that comes from the stigma of social housing also, or that's what stigmatized social housing as being bad quality accommodation. So this is an example of accessibility and affordability. Very quickly, in South Africa, a social housing project, which is rental accommodation in the center of Johannesburg, which provides not only housing for all these 1,000 tenants, but also provides a number of facilities within the complex that reflects their housing needs, such as kindergartens and community kitchens and things like that. Then acceptability, as the fourth principle, relates to the quality of housing outcomes and real housing needs. I mean, the reflection of the housing solution to the real housing needs of people. That determines acceptability, and that usually is connected to cultural aspect of housing, or cultural adequacy. And finally, adaptability, that we see as from two perspectives. One is the one related to the contribution of housing to sustainability objectives, and the fact that housing should consider energy efficiency, resilience, and all these other aspects that can adapt and mitigate the negative effects of climate change. But at the same time, the flexibility that housing needs to accommodate changing needs, as family needs also change, for example, and as society changes. No? And that may be a reflection of what comes next. So this is an example of an acceptability and adaptability principle. It reflects the others as well, but more focus on that, in which this particular apartment building, conceived by Van Schangen, architected in Clarenstraat in Amsterdam, increased acceptability of housing outcomes by designing a building structure of social housing from the 1950s under a bottom-up design strategy. That meant that residents did the renovation collectively and brought the energy level to B, and installed solar panels and were connected to every apartment. But the interesting thing here is that there was a participatory process in which the building was transformed according to the needs of those families that came collectively, and they used the building in different ways, like combining two apartments, using 2 floors, etc., of different sizes. So you see in the change in the in the images what that meant to the change in the facade, no? So that brings me to the core of the presentation, which are how can you apply this principle of looking to this principle of adequate housing in the post-war housing intervention that have been done in the Netherlands. So I brought 3 examples. I think it will be more about the images, because what I want to show in the end is how this is connected to this principle. But what you see here is this Falkenstein building, which is the largest timber built affordable housing complex in the Netherlands, which has an interesting history. It was a post-war. It was built in the post-war Rotterdam neighborhood of Pendrecht. It is a high-rise building, newly built on the site of a demolished one. So that is the connection with the heritage aspect. There was a building there, it was lost to demolition. And now what this project is trying to do is to recover that site, which has a meaning, and build something new. So this is about circularity in building construction, and also sustainability in building construction because of the materials used. It is a 12-story project featuring 11 stories built of cross-laminated timber. Now, what is interesting, I will talk about later when I show the principles. Now, what is very peculiar to this project. Just want to show you how it looks and where it is located. And go to the next one, which is this Wosoko apartments in the Western Garden cities in Amsterdam. As you see, this is about postmodernist architecture, a post-war architecture, where the idea was this garden city idea of bringing light, air, and space around housing complexes. That's why they went into these multi-story housing solutions, to have space around it. No, so the question here is, okay, how do you maintain that quality while renovating the building for the current needs? So what makes this particular is the abundance of public space around the building, and that was a feature that you didn't want to get rid of by extending the building. The client wanted to have 100 apartments for 50 plus people, but that was not possible in that old building to achieve. So the idea that this architectural firm brought was to attach the apartments that could not fit in the original building through these cantilevered houses. So that is pretty interesting to see, no? How these things protrude from the original building. And that was also very carefully planned to make sure that you don't compromise sunlight from the other apartments, and also do not disrupt the adjacent spaces around the building. Just to show you some images of that. And the last one that I want to show is this Bijlmermeer building that they say becomes a klusflat, which is the idea of do it yourself in Dutch. Yeah? And what they did, different to the other 2 projects in which they really intervened the building, they said, okay, let's preserve the original idea of that uniformity that is brought about by such a large building, which is this one. You'll see the picture. I mean, located in Amsterdam, south Ost. It was designed in the 60s and is the only remaining block in the area maintaining its original qualities, meaning what they thought should be. That is based on Le Corbusier's idea of architecture should be used to solve social problems, and then you have these huge buildings which accommodate a great number of families in the same way. And yeah, as I said, inspired by the design to solve social problems through architecture. So it's quite massive. So that was quite a decision, not to say, okay, what do we do with this? It was supposedly was going to be demolished, but there was a lot of protests around this demolition. So they say, okay, let's keep it, but how? So these are all some images. And what is interesting about this one is that what they did is that they renovated the facade. They changed some elements. They emptied the ground floor was for storage. So they made it open for social and public uses, for example, working spaces and places to meet, but also to improve the vertical circulation. And then the apartments were given to people empty for them to distribute the uses the best way they could. So that is what is showing in that, the different options that you can have. Sometimes maintaining the original module of the apartment, sometimes making it bigger, double, etc. So that is the adaptation part of it, and they got it for very low price. So in these last 8 minutes that I have, I'll just show you very quickly. What can you do to refer to the adequate housing in this kind of intervention? And if you look at availability, then you can talk about, okay, how many houses or how many houses units were achieved or given, where is it located, yeah, and how does that reflect the needs as an option. Yeah. Then you see that from the accessibility point of view, infrastructure and public services are made accessible. And for example, in the case of the Weilmer building, the entrance are made available for use as a social space, hosting work spaces and daycare facilities, those improving accessibility to basic services. Then the economic, the affordability aspect, comes from the fact that in many cases, the decisions made also made it possible to save somewhere else. For example, the economic layout of the main structure of the Wasoko building led to saving of 7% of the cost, compensating for the 50% more expensive cantilever units. Yeah. Also, the fact that people could do the inside of the apartments themselves, that meant that the cost of the original unit was quite low. Yeah, so the investment was probably incrementally when they were renovating. That was the case of the Weilmer building. Then, in terms of acceptability, you see that there is a balance between the standardization and customization in the case of the Wasoko, and the creation of open spaces with a human scale, and that is achieved by the cantilever. That you bring down the human scale, and then below those cantilever units, there is the opportunity for people to gather and interact with each other. So that is also happening there. Then in the Falkenstein, the ground floor lobby was made was clad in travertine, which is a post-war material, which was the reference to that building that was there before. Yeah, so that is the connection with the pass-through, the material that was used there before, which has these strong ties to the neighborhood. And then the Weimer building, residents could furnish to their taste, as I said, and even combine 2 or more flats. The entrance are converted to use as a social space. So, the adaptability comes from the fact that you take the building and you adapt it to the new uses and the new needs. And then adaptability, in which you see also that in many of the interventions, I will not read any more this, but in many of the interventions, what you try to do is to adapt the new building to the new energy and label requirements of society now, and also by using materials which are sustainable and using sustainable practices in the building construction. What I forgot to mention, which is quite peculiar about the Falkenstein building, is that this building is made in such a way that you can disassemble it and put it somewhere else. Yeah? And this is a very Dutch concept of moving buildings around, which is quite peculiar. But this one, what gives you the heritage component behind, I found this is particularly interesting, is that they use the original foundations of the demolished building to put that timber structure, which is less heavy, yeah, and is more sustainable in terms of the material, in such a way that they can also take it somewhere else in the future if that is needed. So with that, I want to thank the Heritage Council and the Heritage Skill Associations of Western Australia for the invitation, and also just as a way of advertising, I'm also here because we will be implementing an adaptive reuse workshop between the 28th and the 30th of May in Perth, in Powerhouse in Perth, to talk exactly about this, adaptive reuse. What can you use with this building, and see if that connection with social housing is there. Thank you.
Stay up here. There's some questions.
Okay, put it here.
Up there. If you can take that, move to the side, that would be great.
It's only 2 minutes. So.
If you go in the middle. Yep. Thank you. Okay, we've got a few minutes, so we've got some questions that have come through. So in Perth, we have a Dutch company that's called Denkseman. Are you working together with companies or groups that are working here in Perth?
That is a question for me.
That's a question. Yep, it's on.
I think, I'm not sure I know this. I think Yolanda might know this better. Yeah?
Sorry, can we just get a microphone? Because we've got people online,
Yeah.
They won't hear you. And of
Actually,
course, whoever's asked the question, you can find the team in the lunch break.
Before Yolanda answer, I can put it on the spot, sorry. I come from an institute, educational institute, and research and consultancy. We don't build anything. So maybe that's why it's a difficult question for me to answer.
Did you want to answer?
Yeah, the Heritage Skills Association has been working very closely with the Dutch consulate and Dutch businesses. So yes, we're in conversations.
Great. And so if anyone here wants to come and have a chat with you in the lunch break, they can do so. Terrific. Thank you. Okay, another question. So from your global experience, how do you change people's perspective of what a home should be? So for example, Perth residents typically are less likely to want to live in higher density areas, which has caused great urban sprawl?
That's a very
Just a little
good
question.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and this is exactly the point of discussing this 5A principle of adequate housing. What does it mean, and how does that relate to human settlement planning? And I mean, if I influence the cultural aspect of people wanting to live in single homes, that is a very difficult question to answer. I don't know. But what is true is that it's very important for people to understand that at some point, urbanization in that respect needs to stop, and we need to stop talking about high density and compact neighborhoods where you can have several people from several backgrounds living together and benefiting from basic infrastructure and from the things that you need for your normal living.
Great. And I've just popped the slide up around the adaptive reuse workshop that's on in May for people to take note of. We'll just have one final question and then we'll move on. So WA seems to have lost the ability to move buildings. So in the goldfields, there are many examples of that. Greenbushes, which is a small town out of Metro, has many, and the Pemberton Hotel was built in Greenbushes. How do we re-energise our community to do this? So how do you re-energise communities to want to move buildings?
Wow. Okay. That is
Another big question.
It's a big question. You re-energize. I think for me it's about understanding that particular culture. I can imagine that depending on how you understand what a house is, for example, a nomadic people, that might be a great solution for them. At the same time, you could also say, okay, that with all the mobility that people have nowadays in terms of where the jobs opportunities are and where things are, that they need, maybe having a home that you can move around is not a bad idea. But this is really
broader factors to consider
in the future,
Great.
I guess.
And just a quick question, I think. Were there tenants in the buildings that you were talking about, or did they have to be relocated during construction?
No, the tenants in the building were
The three examples that you gave?
Yeah, the people were not there.
Yeah, so they were moved. Yep.
Yeah. No, these were new people coming into the building. If you look at the big,
so they were empty to start with.
They were right. empty.
So they were not tenanted.
Because the building was dilapidating, and the decision was to demolish, and then there was
Okay. So that answers that question. All right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome.
Please join me in thanking Alonso.